really appreciate you making time to talk. I'll try to. I have a presentation I'll try to use to walk through, and you can use it for notes and for background if you need it. But happy to take questions as we go through, and some of the items I can go into more detail if you want more detail. But I'll try to give you my hope here is in the purpose of coming down is to give you what I think are the facts of the budget as they lay, knowing that we're going to have a revenue forecast tomorrow, and then I expect the House will introduce their budget on Monday, and the Senate. I don't think Senator office has decided yet, but either Tuesday or Wednesday is when I expect that to come out. This year is the House's turn to go first, and not knowing exactly, but having a sense for where they might be, I just want to provide some context and maybe and at the end perhaps some other options that might be used to do the budget if we were writing the budget. So if you hand out just copies of that. While they say not, I would start off by saying we are really, and I don't think you haven't heard this much from the other side of the aisle or from folks in general, but this is in many ways the best situation we've been in budget-wise in this century. And
that's just in terms of revenue.
The revenue has grown tremendously, and we have a very strong economy in Washington broadly. I mean, it's been strong in the central Puget Sound and somewhat in this area for a while, but now it's pretty strong around the state, and we see that. But I would put it maybe slightly differently. Is we have, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but and I'll give you a little background on the budget. But we have a fully balanced budget over 4 years, and you're familiar with the 4-year balance, only state in the country to have that. And we have 500, entering the game on the beginning, the first day of session, we had 500 million in ending fund balance at the end of the 4 years. That's not happened. In the time I've been in the legislature, this is my 4th session, it's not happened. We've always been in a situation where we are between $100 million deficit and $1 billion deficit. So we're starting off positive. Now doesn't mean there's not challenges, but I think that you have to recognize that we have to recognize that's a good place to start from. And I'm going to kind of give you a little background on the budget and then show you how I think that we can get to a place that where we start with a really budget that's fully funded, and we still have quite a bit of money to spend on new policy as we think is wise for the state, and not do new taxes. So if you just flip the slide, first of all, to kind of put the current budget in context, because I think this is really important. Since from the 2011-2013 budget to the current budget, 2017-19, we've grown by 45%. $14 billion growth in budget, and I compare that to the growth in personal income. It's over double the growth in personal income in the state. So I think that shows that we have one, been very fortunate with additional revenue in the state, and two, we've grown. The budget has grown considerably. And I list out a couple key facts here just to kind of underscore that this is not a tight budget. People would make the claim with, I think, some accuracy when we came out of the Great Recession that we had really pulled back on some areas, and there were areas we need to invest in. I don't believe that's the case now. We have a pretty strong budget overall, and if you whether you look at the investment in K-12, which now we are nearly $15,000 per child in funding for K-12, or you look at higher ed, where we have invested in tuition reduction. We've made a number of other.
So you said 15,000 per child. Is that just from the state, or does that include local?
That's total.
Okay.
Most of that is state, but there is
Right.
still some local, and there is some federal in that number too.
Right.
A small amount of federal.
But that's not just the
No.
state money.
Although the state money will approach that based on the current formula faster than I think people realize. It's growing fairly quickly. Mental health, of course, after K-12 over the last few years, probably the biggest area of focus has been mental health, we've doubled the funding at Western states, and yet we still have trouble. That's a different story, but it's not a funding issue. It's not a matter that we haven't raised salaries and invested in mental health at Western states. And then just general public assistance. I don't think folks realize how much we do in public assistance. We actually exceed the state of California in our spending per person for public assistance for low income folks. So I think that just, and then I list out the state employee wage, which I think is, at this point, is above the average private sector wage in all but one county. So 38 of the 39 counties. King County is still just a little bit higher, but it's not much different. So our public sector employees are paid pretty well, in addition to a defined benefit pension and a very attractive health program. So, and our teacher salary is now almost $80,000, with most of that. And I think the big news there is that, unlike a few years ago where it was the percentage was much higher from local levies, now it's almost all paid by the state. So that's kind of, I would characterize this as not a this is not a budget in need of a large recovery. This is a budget and it's fully funded in the maintenance level. And then I don't make up this number. This comes right out of I show you a little picture here of the nonpartisan outlook for the current budget, and you can't read it very well, but circled there is the $510 million in ending fund balance. That's at the end of 4 years. And if you look really carefully, you can't read it very well, but if you look at the budget stabilization account, the rainy day fund at the end of 4 years is $2.9 billion. Highest rainy day fund we've had, which I think is excellent news. I always caution that it's always also the largest budget we've ever had. So if the rainy day fund is to keep us going in a rainy day, knowing that we have a large budget means we have to have a large rainy day fund. We need to continue to invest in that. But again, the point of this is just to show that everybody agrees on these numbers. These aren't controversial numbers at all. Everybody understands this is where we started.
So you got some shell game stuff going on with McClary and that whole impact on the budget, don't you?
What do you mean shell game?
Well, a lot of people's taxes went up.
Mm-hmm.
We've got local school districts who have huge deficits that they don't know how they're going to reconcile yet. But isn't there kind of the idea of McClary was to bring those levy dollars back to the state, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what's being assessed now, or.
So, that's a little bit of sidebar. I don't think there's any shell game there. If you look, every one of the districts in the state, and certainly the large districts, the two large districts here, their budget has gone up considerably. Not just their state budget has gone up very large, but that is more than the reduction in their local levy. So I disagree with any claim that somehow there's less money than there was yesterday. There's quite a bit more money. I mean, on average, the state, if you look at people's budgets, their real budgets from year to year, you're going to see growth of between 30 and 50% on those budgets over a 6-year time frame. Now, there's inflation in that time frame, but inflation in that time is roughly half or less than that. So, are there deficits? Yes, I think that has more to do with the bargaining situation we went through last summer, and frankly, I think the certainly superintendents and school boards have some blame there, if you want to think of it that way. The state does, frankly. We put some. I would have put more restrictions in bargaining as we made that transition, but we put some that I think were pretty good in 2017. Basically, we limited the growth in wages to inflation, roughly 3%, and no other growth. When the majority flipped in 2018, they took that out and basically opened the gate to WEA to negotiate and that's their job. I love them or hate them, that's their job. I'm not personally a big fan, but I recognize that's what they're here for, and they basically ran the table on the whole state, if you want to think about it that way.
Yeah.
So now, as far as overall property taxes, and it varies somewhat by district, and I think you have a mix within your readership, but on average, the property taxes will go down in 2019 by about just over $1 per thousand. It's a meaningful property tax reduction in this year. Nobody argues 2018, the transition year, was a difficult year, but we've now reset that, and I think if we hold the line on local levies, that we'll be in good shape. Now, holding the line, I mean, every district in the state is now, and this, by the way, I predicted, is lining up and saying, no, we can't survive unless you raise local levies again, and I think that would be a disaster for the state.
What's the prospect for that in the legislature? Is there support from Democrats?
It's a good question. It's a good question. I think that we stopped it in the first go-around, both in the House and the Senate. Both the levy bills died in committee at cutoff. Now They're trying to bring back the one in the Senate saying it's NTIB, which I disagree with. But what they've done,
Necessary to implement. the
I'm sorry,
budget.
yes, yeah. So the way the rules work in the Senate is, there's a cutoff date, and after that cutoff date, bills are, in the committee are dead, right? They're trying to say that this bill is necessary to implement the budget, but and they're going to hear a new version of it on Thursday in Ways and Means. I don't know exactly how they're doing this in the House, but the new version they're saying it's necessary to implement the budget because it actually, they're claiming, saves the state money. And from what I've seen so far, and granted this has only been out a day or so, but it looks like it took a bad bill that we heard a month ago and made it worse. And what I mean by making it worse is it allows for the bill we heard before would allow local levies to go up by about $2.5 billion. Put that in perspective. Before when we were facing the levy situation, the entire state raised about $2.5 billion per year in local levies. Now we have it down to about 1.5. This would allow it to go up to 4. So we're not just undoing what we did in terms of reduction of local levies. We are leapfrogging it, and then this version of the bill that we're going to hear on Thursday goes a step farther. Because just to be clear, there's nothing constitutionally wrong about local levies. It's perfectly allowed. The problem is we have, collectively as a state, there's good districts and less good districts, but we have spent that money on basic education, and the state has used that as an excuse to underfund. So it's two things. One, the districts will spend it. Their discipline in spending it has not been exceptional, and two, the state has taken advantage of that and not funded. So this bill literally this substitute literally says, here, now you can raise local levies again, and we're going to save money at the state level doing it. If that doesn't sound like we're going down the same path, I don't know what does.
Yeah, wouldn't that set us up for Son of McClary, I would think?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I actually.
And the levy lid that was passed as part of McCleary, it just, what are the basics of that? How
This
does
is the
that work?
latest one, yeah.
So the levy lid, as we passed in McCleary, and it's unnecessarily complicated, but that's what it took to get to a compromise. It caps the levy rate at $1.50 per thousand or $2,500 per student. For most of the state, they get to $1.50 before they get to $2,500, and then the levy equalization gets them up to $1,500 if that $1.50 does not get them. And then for a few places, think Seattle, Bellevue, Medina, Mercer, San Juan Islands, they can get to $2,500, before they get to $1, and they're for the most part in the 80 cents, 60 to 80 cent range, high assessed values. That is, first of all, it's still in place. What this bill, this is a little more complicated, and again, I'll say we're still figuring it out. It was just introduced. It will allow districts to levy up to $3,000 per child, which, if you're Seattle, doesn't mean a lot. It means you go from 60-some cents to 80-some cents. If you're Woodland, it means to get to 3,000, you probably have to go in the $4 to $5 range. All right, so we go right back to unequal levies around the state, and then it says if you just do it, and it actually reduces your state support if you just do $1.50, but it adds more levy. And this is how it saves levy equalization dollars. But in fairness, it does add additional levy equalization if you raise your tax rate. So it essentially encouraged local districts to raise their tax rate to get more levy equalization again. And it is literally right down the road again. You may have seen this. I emailed it out a few weeks ago, but this graph here, I think, accurately tells the story. That's Dorn when the ratio between the local and state went upside down. We fixed it. This is kind of fixed, and then over the next 30 years, we unfixed it. That's McCleary when they went upside down again. And I think I have maybe that picture's not in here, but. Oh well. Anyhow, we fixed it again. It looks like this again, but if you go forward, am I missing a sheet? if under the bill that's being considered right now, basically we go from the thing we did after between Dorn and McCleary took 30 years, we undo that in 1 year. That's the gist of it. I mean, and my position has been, look, if there's a legitimate education funding need that is not met under the current system, that's a state responsibility. We should find a way to pay for it at the state level. The one that has gotten a lot of discussion this year, and I completely agree with it, is special education. It wasn't technically part of the McCleary decision. They kind of separated it out for, I don't know why, but it clearly isn't being properly funded. State decision. We shouldn't solve that by raising local levy. We should solve that by funding it at the state level. And I think you'll see.
And is that going to happen?
I think so. I will tell you, probably maybe a little too deep. I don't think it's a perfect solution, but the solution that was passed off the Senate floor a week and a half ago is very close. It leaves, I think, a couple infirmities relatively small, but to put it in perspective, current biennial budget has $2 billion for special education. This coming biennial maintenance level growth, which is really growth of the policy set in place in 2017, plus the work that is done this year to add additional funding to increase the ratio and beef up the safety net, goes from $2.2 billion to $2.9 billion. So almost a 50% increase in special education funding. Now, I'm without getting too far in the weeds, I still think there's a small infirmity for small districts on the 13.5%, the limit for the total number of special education children. I think that there's a gap between under this bill. I don't know how familiar you are with this, but basically the way we fund special education children is we use a ratio. So if you're getting $12,500, let's say as an example from the state for basic education for the average child, for special education child right now it's that number times 1.96. This bill would raise it to 2 point, so you'd get another $12,500 for a total of $25,000 per child for special education. The safety net, you can actually apply for it at about $33,000. So there's that gap there. It's not a big gap, and I pushed hard for him to solve that problem also. But I think to be perfect, and I don't think we're ever quite perfect, but I think to be able to say, hey, we've addressed all the problems. You got to solve the 13.5 for small districts that have some of which have a legitimate problem, and close that gap. But in the bigger scheme, we will have flowed funding out, the appropriate amount of funding for special education in the maintenance, the build out of the policy put in place in 2017. We will have fixed the two biggest problems in the current funding formula, which is the ratio and the safety net funding source. And there's two fixes to that really. One is take out the federal money and let it go directly to the schools, which is the right answer. Sidebar: feds under the IDEA is supposed to pay 40% of this. They currently pay about 15%. So there's a whole McCleary-like situation between the state and the federal government, but that we can't fix that problem today. But we do flow that money through and backfill it in the safety net, and then we beef up the safety net. So I think we are on the right track. And going back to the way I said before, legitimate problem. We owe it. The state's responsibility. We shouldn't fix it by raising levels. We should fix it by funding it. I think this goes a long ways towards districts feeling having the funding they do. They should no longer need to come to show up in Olympia and say, hey, we can't balance our budget because we're not being funded in special education. Will they show up with another reason? I highly suspect they will. But this is a legitimate issue, and we should fix it. That's the answer, not get back into the local levy situation.
Thank you for that explanation of the big picture, because it still seems like a shell game to me. Because not that anybody's trying to hide anything, but
it's
when you change a fundamental metric like that everybody gets confused right out of the gate. That's why you had to talk about it for 20 minutes.
Yeah, it is enormously complicated. We could spend the rest of the day talking about that. I mean, 295 districts are a very complicated system. Yeah. It is complicated, and I would make no claim that it's perfect, but it's a lot closer than it was 2 years ago. Just getting back to the budget overall, this kind of just highlights the good news we've had. We did nothing. We got good news just as a result of the economy and everything. We've had $200 million more than the projection in revenue since the November forecast. And then we've had caseloads go down by about $700 million. And so $700 million sounds like a lot when you're talking about a $50 billion budget, and that's caseloads from K-12 enrollment to higher ed enrollment to TANF or SNAP benefits or DOC. So it's a whole range of things. Most of that number or a lot of that number, I should say, is driven by inflation. Inflation has been lower than most folks expected, particularly in the last few months, but even over the last year it's been lower. So when you're talking about a $50 billion budget, small moves in inflation drive big cost, savings. So you take the 500 we started with, the 200 and the 700, and you end up with, $1.4 billion, strong maintenance level funded budget. Now we have $1.4 billion to spend on new policy, should we choose to. All right, we know we have the forecast tomorrow, and it's hard to tell what the state economists will do with the additional 200 in essentially 3 months is a lot of new revenue. But so if you just multiply that out, that'd be over 4 years, about a little over $3 billion. He's not going to be anywhere close to that because he's going to be very cautious about the out years. Everybody is wondering, okay, we've been in a good economy for a long time. We're going to have a recession. Is it in 2020 or 2021? And so I expect it will either be, I think it'll be in the $400 to $500 million in additional revenue over the 4 year period. But it could be less than that. He could be very conservative. I doubt very much it will be more than that. But nonetheless, just what we know today, we're $1.4 billion good. And this next slide is a little more complicated, but what I want to show you is, and this is not unique to this year. Every year you deal with budgets this size, there's a lot of ways you can get savings or additional revenue without changing tax law and without impacting services. And I'll go through this list, and I'll try and go to a relatively high level just in the interest of time, but if you have more questions, I'll be happy to dig into it more as you go down here. Some of the things, and some of these have happened or some of these will happen. I expect, just in general, these aren't like really pointy items that are partisan. Most of these I think will be in both the House and the Senate budget. And a few of them may not be, but most of them I think will be. And the first one is a very simple one. You save $480 million, and that seems like a lot of money, but all that is when you look at what the agencies are spending right now to deliver services, and think about the enormous growth in the budget, what they're spending down to spend services and grow the maintenance level from that expenditure instead of what they're appropriated. They're all spending below what they're appropriated. Most of this has to do with FTEs that are not filled. They're appropriated for, but they're not filling. And unlike in recent years, we've had FTEs like at Western States that were appropriated but weren't filled. This isn't the case with most of these. This isn't a case where we know we have a need, we know we funded it, we just haven't been able to hire. Actually, at Western States, they've done a good job of filling the FTEs. So I think this is a pretty good base, and if you just reset the maintenance level to the current base, you save 480 over the 4 year time period. The next one is actually two different things. So just take the $360 million in savings and divide it in half. Roughly half of it is what we call here program integrity staff, but it's really fraud investigations. So again, perspective, we spend $6 billion per year on health care for our low income population, and we've made this transition over the last several years from fee for service for that health care to managed care. And for some reason, and frankly, nobody can quite answer why, as we did that, we basically got out of the fraud investigation business. We just have a whole basically department that did that, and we basically through atrophy or lack of interest, not clear why, we were basically almost out of that business. And this is not, we are an outlier. Well, the states around us that have a similar spend, they're doing fraud investigations. If you think about spending $6 billion a year, the idea that, finding $45 million in fraud a year is not, that's very consistent. And if you look at, and this is assuming if we detect fraud, we collect it 50% of the time. We can go back and pull that money. So it's not a very aggressive assumption. Right now, we're at about 37%. And not only is our collections low, our detection is gone down. Again, we are an oddball here, and so all this does is basically invest in some. Tells inside the budget says HCA, put your fraud investigation team back together and do a decent job of investigating, and we expect we will save quite a bit of money. The other side of this, and I should make this two bullets, but is a different. It's again connected to the managed care organizations, but it's a different issue. In the underlying maintenance level budget, they have almost a 9% rate increase. Very unusual. Typically, they're in the 3 to 4% rate increases. So this is high to begin with. That got everybody's attention, bipartisan basis. Everybody's attention. Why such a big increase? And we looked at it. They do have the actuarial validation, which is required by federal law. So, so we're not messing with the maintenance level, but we do know that it's a large increase. At the same time, we looked at HCA is required under federal law to do an evaluation of their managed care organizations. And so there's 5 that work under this contract under the Apple Health umbrella. And frankly, that evaluation came back very poor. We were below the 50th percentile on all but one item across the board. We were below the 33rd percentile for maternal care and for care for children. So we're clearly not doing very well. So, the context is $6 billion a year, a 9% increase, and the audit says we're not doing a good job of delivering care to our low-income folks. So all this does is say, and this is allowed under federal law, when we spend that money, we're going to keep a 3% holdback, and we're going to measure you against measures, and we've worked with HCA to come up with measures for each of these, and you need to perform above the 75th or 70. Above the 75, and that's not percentile any longer, 75% of the national average. Percentile's got to be a little bit hard to measure because, if there are 10 of us in the room and we're all doing a good job, half of us are still below the 50th percentile. So we switch it to the national average, which is a better measure. And if you perform, we're going to hold 3% back, and you have to perform above the 75% of the national average in these measurement areas to get that remaining 3%. And we expect they'll get about half of that back. Be a great thing if they got it all back. It would mean they're doing a good job and they're getting good care, and that's the message. But we think based on historic performance, they'll earn about half of that back. And we think that's a good way to both get the best bang for the taxpayer's dollar and to ensure that we get the best health care for the folks that we're covering. So that's what that is. The next one is actually already been passed out of both the Senate and the House and signed by the governor, and that's just to take the Main Street Fairness Act that we did in 2017, applying sales tax to internet sales, and lining it up with the U.S. Supreme Court decision on Wayfair. And that ends up bringing in about $300 million more. And just to be clear, that's not changing the law with regard to who is getting taxed. When we put that in place in 2017, the way that worked is the Department of Revenue has to put a fiscal note together for it, and they said, okay, we're going to collect this much money, and we have one large unnamed retailer in our state that will be about 50% of that. You can figure out who that is. And they've already said they will fully comply, so we're going to count that uptake at 100%. The other 50% of the potential collections is a whole mix of folks, and we don't know. Some of them are, will likely fully comply. Some of them we don't know. Some of them have different technologies. They counted that at about 50% uptake. So there's a bunch of taxes owed that they just realistically didn't think they'd get collection in the years. That $300 million really comes from, now we have a clear law that's in place for the entire country. We line up with it, and that uptake percentage went up. That's all that is. So pretty painless. The next thing is the hospital safety net, which has been in place for over a decade now, and that simply renews it. Hospitals don't like it. They want an extension date to make sure the state treats them fairly in this deal. I don't blame them. So that also has been passed out of the Senate. So again, not very pointy. And the next three things, the left two payments, there's a law passed in, I think, 2005, 2007, somewhere in there, that said every year the state's got to put every biennium rather, $50 million into this pot, in this fund, and eventually we'll come back and we want to negotiate better benefits for the left two folks. We have never funded it. Not ours, not D's. No one has ever funded it. All this does is say we're not going to fund it anymore. It gets built into maintenance level because the law says it should be, but also allows us not to fund it. That's all that is. And then the next one, and you've been through this one recently in this area, is the BHO reserves. Federal and state law says when you move from a BHO to a behavioral health organization to the managed care organization, the BHOs had a reserve in place to make sure they could continue mostly mental health services, and with the managed care organization, that reserve, the managed care organization has to keep the reserve. It's not a state reserve, and it is built into their rate. So by law, we have to return any monies from that reserve back to the feds, and the state reserves come back to us. And that was actually a big issue, if you'll recall, I think in 2015 or 16 for the BHO here, because Clark County made the transition. And this is all the remaining ones in the state. A portion of the state has already made that transition. The rest of them have to make that transition. That'll add about $80 million.
Excuse me, I have to go, but I'm dying to ask you one question before I leave. It's a slight side trip.
Sure.
Have you guys seen the Seattle TV station video on entitled "Is Seattle Dying"?
I got it yesterday. I haven't seen the video. I read about it.
We watched it last night. It's a if it's
Accurate?
accurate, and I fear that it is. You got a mess of statewide significance in Seattle. My God, it's just ridiculous. Any thoughts? I mean, I'd love to talk to you after you see this. And see what the thoughts are, because we have our own homeless problem here, but it's nothing compared to what I saw last night on that story.
Yeah, I haven't seen the story yet. I'd be happy to see it and then talk to you. I think that they have a real problem on their hands, and I think it's largely of their own making, and I'm not sure they have the political will to undo it. I think there is, and I don't represent Seattle, and I only go to Seattle periodically, but I think my understanding from talking to folks up there is a lot of, they expect a full change out of the city council, but the challenge isn't so much that is, it will change out for other folks that, the population likes certain policies, and those policies are clearly not working. And so do they have, like, I think of it, do they have a Giuliani moment at something like New York City did? I ask people that all the time if that's the way it's going to happen, and I haven't got a clear affirmative answer.
They need a Giuliani moment.
They do.
They showed one graph of the amount of, I forgot what the metric was, but New York was on the good end of it. Seattle was on the second to the worst end.
Yeah. Put in perspective, I believe if the numbers are still accurate, Seattle has more homeless than the entire state of New York, including New York City. Unsheltered homeless.
Yeah.
It's
crazy.
It is absolutely crazy. That's the right word. I don't know if they can pull themselves out of it, but they're in the midst, and again, I don't want to get into the Seattle, anti-Seattle mindset, but they're pulling us with them is the challenge we have. I mean, we have to be careful. We won't get there by saying by building the Seattle. We got to say we're in this together, and by the way, we don't want to go. So we have to. A lot of work to do there. Happy to talk about that separately.
That's good. So I know where you're going with this.
Yes.
Because I've been hearing the vibe.
Yeah.
But I gotta go.
The simple message is, and we're going to get to the end, is we're in great shape. We don't need more taxes. Right. And by the way, I'll show you an idea of how you might spend the money is one option.
Okay. These guys will phone me in.
Okay, great.
Thanks a lot.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, thank you. So the bottom one is some fund balance transfers that typically happen in every budget. Just to be clear, that does not include the public works assistance account. Nothing in there. So it's a bunch of small funds that we typically move around. But all this adds up to now $3 billion. Solid maintenance covered budget and $3 billion to spend on new policy ads. You got $3 billion to spend on
$3 billion after 4 years.
in 4 years. That's
Okay,
right.
got it.
$3 billion 4 years, $1.5 billion in 2 years to spend on policy. There should be no reason to raise taxes to get this budget done. That's the message I'm kind of building up to. And then, if you flip to the next page, I'll shift gears a little bit and say, hey, how would I suggest you spend $3 billion? And this is kind of high level because I don't think I don't think it's helpful to wade into the deep, but it's based on a framework that says we can spend this very responsibly for the state writ large, and I think get good results for the state. And I'll start on this little pie chart on the bottom left on education. So we can put 750 into education. That starts for me with special ed, and I think we could do even more than we currently think. I think we talked about the multiplier to 2.0, and we talked about the safety net. I think we could actually, 750 million over 4 years, we can actually do more than that. But we also have some investments to make in our higher ed system. there's some foundational things that I think we need to do there to make sure it's in good shape. And I'd love to do tuition reduction again, but I actually think there's some higher priorities. Some folks will say we ought to make investments in the need grant, and there's a proposal. It's passed out of the Senate. I didn't support it to make the need grant an entitlement, and they changed the name to the Washington Promise. I push back on this for the simple reason is right now we spend about $700 million per biennium on the need grant. In addition to that, we have about $250 million that we spend on tuition waivers that essentially work just like the need grant, right? And we direct our universities to do that. $1 billion for need grant right now, far ahead. We're the best in the country, not even close. We're already doing a great job there. I don't see why, of all the things, it's not that it's not good to put more money into this. It's like, of all the things we could do, why would we put more money into something we were already kicking butt on? It doesn't make sense. So, but I think there are some other investments in higher ed, and I think there's some investments. We know that the ECAP is going to be, the entitlement is fully in place in 2021. So we're not yet still on a straight glide path into fully funding those slots. So I would do that also. So you can invest, but the big, larger point, you can invest significantly in education at all levels. Social services, you spend $750 there. The big one there is in mental health, and I think you'll see that come out as a pretty bipartisan proposal. We've been working very collaboratively on a mental health system that emphasized community mental health, that build out facilities. And I think that's the real difficult part. It just takes time.
And the $450 million for mental health, does that include Western State? That
includes Western State. So a couple different things that go with that. It does not include the additional money to backfill the federal. That's already in there. What it does include over 4 years is a build-out replacement for Western State. So this could take another hour to discuss, but the essence of it is, Western State is decertified. There's not an economical way to recertify it because all the things we were grandfathered in before for just simple code issues, we got to start from scratch. So it'd be a major renovation to Western State, the facility, that would be more expensive than building new. So, and not only that, it's not the best way to handle those folks. So there'll be a little bit of investment in Western States to kind of carry us through, and in particular, we're moving 2 civil wards turn them into forensic wards. But more broader picture will involve a significant build out of community facilities, so ENT, crisis centers, transition housing.
So similar to what the governor proposed.
Yeah, on a quicker scale and without the other state hospitals. That's how I would put that. So a lot of support for the training hospital at UW at the Northwest campus, about 150 beds there. A lot of new community beds, a fair amount of private community beds to backfill, but building out beds so you can move folks out of Western into other spots, basically get out of that building on the civil side, and then on the forensic side, build a new, probably around 250 bed, I think it is 250 bed, facility on the campus at Lakewood to take over the forensic and then basically shut that facility down long term. And the governor had it, I think, over almost 8 years. The push, again, bipartisan, is to get this down closer into the 4 to 5 year time frame. That really move quickly, in particular on the community mental health and on the training hospital at UW. 2 reasons: it gives us capacity. It's already a facility. Gives us capacity pretty quickly at a good. It's about $200 million to do this, which is probably the best price we're going to get, and then build the forensic hospital out. So, but push harder to do this more quickly. That's the gist of it there. And then the other, I put it as $300 million. For me, that's mostly about. There's a lot of places you can invest. This is mostly invest in. It's either DD or senior care, making sure their rates are competitive and that we're maintaining capacity to treat those vulnerable populations. A lot of good things you can do there that I think have an enormous positive investment for the state. The next one is compensation. So the first 2, I think that I think that's by and large, with some individual differences, we line up pretty close with the D's. They're going to spend more money, is what I'm worried about, when they already have quite a bit of money to spend. The second half, I would just make the case that we ought to think about it a little differently. So you've probably heard about the collective bargaining agreement negotiated by the governor. It's $1.5 billion over 4 years, largest collective bargaining agreement negotiated in state history for the 6th year in a row, and in the context of what I said earlier, our state employees are already making more than our private sector employees in all but one county in the state, and even that one's close. Plus, they have a defined benefit pension. They have the best health care in the state. Their turnover is right around 10%. Half of that's retirements. Another portion of it's promotions. So they do not have. If you think about, compare that to either the public sector across the country or the private sector, they're well below turnover rates. There's no justification for excessive increases, and that's what a big chunk of that CBA is. If you only do 3% per employee per year, plus the step increases, which are already built into the maintenance level, that only costs you half of what the total cost of the CBA is. So I would advocate, hey, public employees are important. We got to treat them well. We are treating them well, and a 3% per year raise over the next few years is, knowing that many of them will also get step increases. That's a very, very good offer, and I would take the other half of what you would otherwise spend on a collective bargaining agreement that doesn't do much for the state, and I would invest in transportation, and that's the bottom quarter. And what that really means is, and you may have heard this proposal, it's been floating out there for a little while now, is take the sales tax on motor vehicles and take that out of the general fund, out of the operating budget, and put it into the transportation budget. And what that does,
would that go to an I-5 bridge?
It could go to a number of things. A bridge is one. I would lump it in two categories. I would lump it in, and first of all, we have the culvert decision that we got to fund, and we have a while. But if you do the math, it's going to cost us $100 to $200 million a year to fund that over 15 years to get those. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court's declined our appeal. We have the ruling we have. We got to get on with it. And frankly, I represent most of the Shalish River Basin. I've been working on water projects since I got in the legislature. I'm somewhat sympathetic to it. I mean, if we're going to solve our big water infrastructure issues, culverts are going to be part of that. Okay? But my point is, we don't need necessarily a new transportation package to do that. We have the ability to look at that, and I think that's a good investment for the state. So that's one bucket. The other bucket, I think, is transportation projects that did not get funded inside the Connecting Washington package. And I think the two top ones in the state, from my view, are here with the I-5 bridge, and then there's some stuff in Snohomish County that really is creating problems. So, I mean, those are two big items that were not funded in Connected Washington, and I think this goes a long way towards solving all those problems. And then more fundamentally, we have, if you look out 5 to 10 years in our transportation budget overall, we have a bonding issue, and everybody knows this. Is gas taxes going down? We have bonded. Our whole debt issue in our state is all about transportation bonding. We've kind of got off track starting in the early 90s through today, and we need another source of funding, and we need to turn that corner a little bit on bonding. And I think, again, this all fits together to try to do that without layering on another transportation package, which I don't think, frankly, is realistic. I mean, even in good times, it takes 2 or 3 years to build support for that. But you've probably seen the one that was introduced by Senator Hobbs, and a gas tax, a carbon tax, a impact fee of essentially, and then half a dozen other small taxes. I don't think I don't see it's not going anywhere, not in that form. But we could do this. So you asked me, hey, there's a way to both treat state employees well and to make what I think is a more valuable investment in our state's future. Why don't we consider the use of the sales tax for motor vehicles, clear nexus to transportation, to support the transportation budget? So again, this isn't the only way. It's just, if you want to look at a big picture, how might we do this differently? And stop thinking about, it's not a case of we only get good and bad ideas in Olympia. We're always going to be faced with deciding between what's the best investment for the state of Washington, and I think this is a approach that does that, and recognizing we just want to we can live within our means, we can make new investments, and we can do all that without new taxes. So that's the gist of what I came to talk to you about today.
What are the odds of a carbon tax getting passed?
So I think relatively low. I think on both. Well, I mean, we haven't had much or any support really from my side of the aisle, and that's not to say there couldn't be support from my side of the aisle. I just said I think both the 732, which I liked part of that. I liked the return to the tax reform that went with that, and the 1631. I got the number right.
Probably.
The carbon tax, whatever it was. I think they weren't well done. And during the session we had one that, it had 50 tax exemptions. It got killed on the weight of its own. So I think it could happen. I think it's fairly unlikely. I think if it's going to happen, the only way it would happen is if in a carbon tax that was pretty low, say in the $15, $20 per ton, did not have a growth in it, and B, took most of that money, if not all of it, and put it back into tax reform. And I have, the tax reform I would advocate for is what I call homestead tax exemption. I think that would be a powerful way to make our whole tax system more progressive. And what that is is it basically exempts the first $100,000 of your home from state property tax. So if you have a $100,000 home, it's a full exemption. If you have a $500,000 home, it's a 20% exemption. So it's progressive in that sense. That's one thing. There are other things I think we could do that I don't think we have to. I don't think it's politically possible to overhaul the whole thing, but I think there's things we can do within the system we have to kind of what 732 tried to do, but I think you can do it in a more effective way. And then, so personally, I would also think if we were going to do that, I'd like to see some of that money put into water infrastructure. And I go back to, whether it's culverts or flooding, the Chehalis River Basin, or stormwater, legacy stormwater. I think, Vancouver, Seattle, Tacoma, Spokane, where, we can have enormous impact on our water quality by dealing with legacy systems that were there, they're grandfathered in before we had the current standards. But it's expensive to do. There's never going to be a funding source that just pops up for, Vancouver as an example to do that. But we know we can save a lot. We can do a lot better to improve our water quality doing that. Than we can't squeeze enough water quality out of the next new building to make up for the legacy stuff. And on the west side, or the east side rather, it's water storage. How do we help the Yakima, the Yakima River Basin or Othello and dealing with water storage? And frankly, I think that's an east side issue right now, but it will be a west side issue in the future. So, for a number of different reasons. I mean, even in where I live in Chehalis, we have a water supply issue in the middle of the summer because they have water rights out of the Nisqually, Newaukum River, and the Newaukum River. More detail than you need, but they have a little reservoir, and it basically has a weir off for their supply. That supply now goes dry in the middle of July. Now they have another water rights on the Chehalis, so they don't run out of water. But the point is, these problems exist. They're not showing themselves every day on the west side, but they will. So I would like to see, in the name of resilience, if you do a carbon tax, that you put some. Most of it I'd like to see go back to taxes reform, help people out. But some of it I think could go into water infrastructure and resilience, and I think broadly people would be supportive of that.
What about the odds of the capital gains tax?
If I'm making odds today, I'd put them at 50-50. I think maybe not quite that high. There's still a fair amount of resistance. Our caucus still calls it an income tax, as we think it is. A lot of the new members in the Senate, at least, are very supportive of new taxes. This is part of the reason I wanted to share you with the basis is the fact that they want new taxes doesn't mean we need new taxes. The capital gains tax, there are still a couple people that are opposing it in the other caucus. That's good. It's very. I think if they do it, I think it'll be pushed out a couple years. For the simple reason, it's almost certainly to have some legal challenge,
Sure.
And it's going to take a couple years to work through that. So I think that at least on the Senate side, Senator Rolfes is, we as you might imagine, we just don't agree on everything, but she's very professional and she's very careful. So I think that she will be skeptical of counting that as a way to add spending in the near term. She might decide that's a thing that she could pass and get in front of the courts, and maybe that affects the third or fourth year of the 4 year. But Again, I'm flat out guessing, just to be clear,
Right.
but I would say it's a 50-50 chance.
So the last couple budget sessions have gone really long, so because of McClary and everything. So when, what are the odds that legislature's going to have a budget by, say, the 1st of June?
Oh, I think by the 1st of June, the odds are really good we'll have a budget. Will they be done by the end of April? I think there is, and that's got good and bad
Wow.
aspects to it. I mean, I hate long sessions or extra long sessions as much as anybody, but if it's a choice between, billions of dollars in new taxes and the additional cost of an extra session, I've made the argument that the extra session is better than holding. Last summer, or last year rather, and this no way picking on Senator Office, who I think has done a very professional job. I think she didn't understand how difficult negotiating with the House can be. They are used to getting their way. They've gotten their way for a long time, and basically the Senate got run over by the House in the supplemental budget, and I think that she's better prepared for that this time. She didn't, because they're friends, right? They're from the same party. Of course, we'll always agree. No, it's not true. They will want it, and this is not partisan. They will want it their way. It's just I'm not trying to be mean or anything. It's just that's how it works. And so I think this year they've done a better job of trying to reach out early. That's my impression. I'm not in the room there, so I don't know. But my impression from talking to them individually is they've tried to manage expectations on each side better in the effort to get out on time. I think they think there's a high political value to get out on time, that they can say to the people, look, when one party controls the whole place, we get out on time. I think that, but I worry, so that's the good news. The bad news is to get out on time, so last year, just to put it in perspective, supplemental budget, Senate came in here, House came in here, final budget came in here. All right. So, is that a price you want to pay? Is the question. That's what I worry about. I mean, I live close to Olympia, so for extra innings, I am able to get back to the day job and still. I mean, the reality is with an extended session, most folks are not in Olympia.
Right.
They're back in their districts, and there's a few people that are working on budget issues, and that is frustrating certainly. But of the again, not choosing between two perfect options, I would take a longer session and a better budgetary outcome if we could get it. But I think we could get a good budget. I think it's possible to get a good budget outcome and in on time with no new taxes. I'm just not. I'm worried. We'll find out. We'll know more a week from now.
Right. So, as far as the budget for Republicans, what is the best you can hope for this year? No new taxes, or?
I think that's the best we can hope for. I don't think we're going to get a tax break. I mean, I think that you could.
Right.
You saw my little quad chart. You could make an argument that there could be a tax break in there or a tuition reduction or something that helped the average person. I think that's unrealistic. That's not likely to happen. But I do think it's a possibility. I don't think it's large, but that's why I'm here talking to you today, is to make sure people know, hey, we are in historically very good times. There's no reason to raise taxes now, because, by the way, if you increase spending now, that recession is coming at some point. I mean, more chances that we can't sustain it in the next downturn. So I'll make that case, and I'll make it as forcefully and hopefully as logically as I can, reasonably to folks around the state, and maybe that helps bring them down from taxes. And we might get really good news tomorrow at the forecast, and that helps bring them down. But I also, manage my own expectations internally into my caucus. I mean, we're in the minority. I tell people, look, we shouldn't expect an A for this session. We don't want an F. Best bet is a B minus. Keep it in perspective. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't push for an A. It just means manage expectations. The other side is they got relatively large majorities, and they're not the same majority. Even if you go back to the majorities they had in the earlier 2000s, they're not the same. There's not a large blue dog or whatever they call them now caucus in either chamber.
Blue Dog Democrat, I think.
Blue Dog Democrat.
So.
I think we call them Hobbs likes to call it the roadkill caucus, but I think Blue Cog is probably a nicer
Those are the
name.
ones that get
But-
caught in the middle
but-
between the D's and the R's and get, yeah.
Those folks still exist. I mean, you use Steve Hobbs as an example. He's pretty moderate, and I think he would be very happy to get out of town without taxes. Mark Mullet from the Issaquah area, very moderate, would love to get out of town without new taxes. The question is, can you find 4 people in there out of 28 that see no need for new taxes? I don't know. We're gonna do our best to find. I mean, that's my job is to go help them make the case to 4 people that are willing to stand against that. And if they'd make that case, then I think we have a good chance of getting out of here with a better budget. But we got, 5 weeks left, 5.5 weeks left.
Well, from a headline standpoint, it can be, state spends $3 billion more, no new taxes, or a state budget goes up $5 billion with $2 billion in new taxes. That's
Or Governor Inslee goes up 10 million over 4 years with 10 million in new taxes. I mean, he set the bar high, but I mean, I don't think, frankly, that weighs in. I mean, that's been the case for a number of years. You're not picking on him, just saying that's where he's chosen to be budget-wise. So I don't think anybody on either side of the aisle took that as the basis to start from.
Sure.
Yeah. This isn't a Gary Locke or even a Christian Gregoire budget where they said, well, it was in the governor's budget and that had significant meaning. It just doesn't now.
I don't think so. So thanks for the good overview.
Gentlemen,
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate you making time.